Fighting games had a rough start in the arcades, particularly those more complex than just boxing games. The earliest example of an arcade game based on martial arts didn't come until 1984, with Data East Karate Champ, developed by none other than Technos Japan. And they were later responsible for the Renegade and Double Dragon series. Its most immediate competitor was Konami's arcade classic Yie Ar Kung-Fu, which had a more entertaining manner of presenting martial arts in a game opposed to clean and technical. Then there was the Way of the Exploding Fist, which came from fledgling Australian developer Beam Software and was tailored for the UK market by its publishing wing Melbourne House for the Commodore 64 in 1985. Now, Melbourne's House, The Way of the Exploding Fist, became more of a direct competitor to Karate Champ because it focused on the technical side of simulating one-on-one karate fighting. The convenient part of it was that Exploding Fist was only developed for home computers, which would only get you invest your money once in the game and let you become a master of martial joystick arts in your living room instead of wasting coins in an arcade machine. Perhaps even more conveniently, neither Karate Champ or Yie Ar Kung-Fu got their home conversions until months after Exploding Fist. And as well as the Commodore 64 version, it was also later ported to the Amstrad CPC, the ZX Spectrum, BBC Micro, Acorn Electron and Commodore 16. And the development team consisted of Greg Barnett, Bruce Bailey and David Johnson. And the game's soundtrack, well, that was also written by Neil Brennan, and it was based on the 1952 orchestral piece Dance of the Yo People. It has been praised for the excellent atmosphere it provided, and it was also one of the reasons behind the popularity of the game. The game was a bestseller, especially in the United Kingdom. But why was Exploding Fist so fantastic? Well, if you could afford 2 joysticks to hook up to your computer, you could recreate a karate battle, just 1 year after Karate Kid hit the theatres. 2 years later, when Street Fighter hit the arcades, well, Exploding Fist would fade from the cultural memory. But again, in terms of something gamers could experience at home, it was groundbreaking. So, for my video, we're going to look at all these game versions of The Way of the Fist. There was also a Nintendo Entertainment System version which was originally developed by Beam Software, with the last prototype being from 1990. And the prototype was modified to be finished, and the final release was made in 2019 by Pico Interactive. And the Pico version has also been released for the Evercade handheld console in 2021, and we'll look at those versions too. And then finally, well, there was a number of unofficial releases, and we'll dive into those also. But first, let's start by looking at the original Commodore 64 version. The Commodore 64 version was released in 1985. Exploding Fist puts you in control of a budding martial arts expert, complete with all his skills. By exploiting these skills, you must fight your way up through several levels to the exalted ranks of the Shaolin monk. The game has various backgrounds that change as the player progresses through the levels. This includes inside a dojo, an outdoor field with snowy mountains, volcanoes, a Buddha statue, or some pagodas. To get closer towards your goal, you need to show that you are worthy by knocking the living daylights out of the other player, either a human or controlled opponent, over a series of bouts. To win a bout, you need to knock down the other player enough times. Depending on how well you do this, you are given points in the form of yin-yangs, and a score depending on the choice of a manoeuvre, which are displayed at the top of the screen. For example, a poorly executed but effective kick, punch, etc. will earn you a measly half point, and will add 100 points to your overall score, whereas a good kick will earn you a full point and a couple of 100 points to the overall score. Should you prove the better man after 2 full bouts, you will move up a level to a new backdrop and a tougher adversary. And each of these levels is known as a Dan, and is an indication along with your score as to how well you are doing. After every 4th screen, there is a surprise in store in the form of a small task to earn bonus points, and it's up to you to discover those surprises. The game control is via joystick or direction keys and a fire key. 18 different movements can be made, including jumping kick, roundhouse kick, and a variety of punches and kicks high and low. And after completing a number of progressively harder stages, the player is charged up by a bull in a bonus round. And the player must knock this bull out with a single hit. And apparently this bonus round mirrors the feats of Mas Oyama, a karate expert who purposely killed bulls with a single strike. And apparently this bonus round was not present in the ZX Spectrum version, which we'll look at, nor some of the early Commodore 64 versions too. Now, the background graphics in the original Commodore 64 Way of the Exploding Fist are decidedly oriental, more particularly Japanese. You get a view of Fujisan and some other mountains in 3 of the game's 4 screens, a Buddha statue, cherry trees, a torii, a pagoda, a miniature garden, and 1 screen is taken from inside of a training facility. Your sensei in his long black moustache and grey robe is sitting further behind in the first 2 screens, judging away your bouts, and comes slightly closer in the latter 2 levels. Now, I wouldn't necessarily agree with all the colour choices here. The sky is turquoise instead of light blue, whereas the watery bits could be darker blue, and the ground is a bit unmovingly yellow on all the screens, probably for good, technically restricted reasons. I suppose from the Commodore 64's palette, yellow fits the least worst simultaneously with white, red, pink and black. Also, I'm not sure purple is a very natural colour for a mountain, but it goes together with the turquoise sky. Taking into consideration the C64's restrictions, the colour scheme couldn't have been much better, though at least in this context. I suppose with an 8-bit machine you have to give some artistic freedoms anyway. There's also a good amount of room which has been left for the info panel at the top, which is mostly just basic text and a font that's annoyingly close to the Commodore 64 system font, and all the text is dark blue, which fits nicely together with turquoise, I suppose. The yin-yang symbols are really the only actual graphics in the info panel. Now, I want to talk about the sound here in this game. Prior to Exploding Fist, Oriental fighting games didn't have particularly Oriental soundtracks. But for this game, the designers decided upon getting that part of the equation right, which helps with the immersion a bit more than in games like Karate Champ and Kung Fu Master. The soundtrack in Exploding Fist is based on the Chinese piece Dance of the Yue Tribe, which was written in 1952. The soundtrack consists of 3 clearly different pieces of music, of which the demo mode features the most obvious excerpt from Yo People, and is considered by most fans as the centrepiece in the soundtrack. The in-game tune is slower, more atmospheric piece that has nothing to do with Yo People, apart from perhaps being an inspiration by Neil Brennan to write it. It's not exactly what you would expect a fighting game to have if you've grown up with the techno-laden fighters like Tekken and Toshinden, but since this is a more thoughtful and strategic one-on-one fighting game, the ambient music suits Exploding Fist very well. There's also a third tune, a short jingle which plays when your game is over, which is perhaps a bit too stereotypical, but because of its shortness and placement, it's acceptable. Voice samples were always an event when such luxuries appeared in an 8-bit game, and somehow they seemed to be even more effective than any other cases when you heard them in martial arts games. In the C64 original, all sound effects are samples, although there aren't that many of them. If I have counted correctly, there are 3 different shouts, mostly pitch variants. One sound effect is for delivering a hit, and one is for when you take a fall. It's not all that much, yet it's enough to make the action more realistic. So what's my overall thoughts of the Commodore 64 game? Well, this really was the first face-to-face karate game out for the Commodore 64, and when it was released it created quite a storm. Rightly so, because even now it provides a real test. For me, the graphics are well drawn, although I have to say the sprites move at a rather slow pace for me. The sound though is excellent. I love the tune to Fist and the crunching sound effects. I think I even prefer the sound effects to International Karate. Sure, it's quite a difficult game with many moves to master, but overall this genre of game has been surpassed by the likes of International Karate and IK+. However, this will always have fond memories for me and remains a classic Commodore 64 game. There you go. Right, so let's have a look at the ZX Spectrum game next, which was released in 1985 by Melbourne House. The conversion for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum was programmed by Greg Barnett, William Tang, Stephen Taylor, and the graphics by Stephen Taylor and Greg Holland. Now, looking at the ZX Spectrum version, it does play slightly slower compared to the Commodore 64 version, but I have to say you wouldn't really notice it. Now, this version does feature 3 of the original's 4 screens, with the second one missing, which, taking everything into consideration, are both very nice in their own ways. While the Spectrum version certainly has more colour, some of the colour clash is a bit too clashy, but it hardly matters when you're mostly looking at your monochrome fighters in their black and greyish robes. And also, it has those beeper sounds, and there's no 128K version either. Perhaps all for the better, the amount of music has been reduced to only 1, which is the Game Over jingle from the Commodore 64 version, which is now shortened to half of it, and used for the beginning of each match instead of its rightful Game Over spot. However, the lack of music has been compensated with a bit more sound effects, all of which are sampled. Sure, the samples are not in as high quality as the Commodore 64, but they have more variety, which is a nice alternative. Let's have a look at the game. Okay, let's have a look at the Amstrad CPC version, which was done by Greg Barnett, Cameron Duffy and Dam, and again it was published by Melbourne House in 1985. An upgraded version called The Way of the Fist Plus was also released for the Amstrad CPC in 1986. The Amstrad version runs just slightly faster than the Commodore 64 version. The original Commodore 64 version is the only one to feature as many as 4 different locations, at least in a single load. There is a Fist Plus for the Amstrad, which features 4 locations, but they're all loaded in separately, but otherwise it doesn't really differ from the original single location CPC version. Having only 1 location though might contribute it being slightly faster than the Commodore 64 version though. For me, this version is definitely one of the most playable ones, as it's just a bit faster than the original, but it suffers from a lack of graphical content to give incentive to play for very long. And as I said, the original Amstrad version only has 1 screen to play in. This location is not featured in the Commodore 64 version, so we're a bit off the map, but not that wide off the mark. It's just a large temple though, with 2 lined statues and your sensei sitting between them. The info panel is as similar to the original as you might expect, and the colour scheme differs in any important manner only by having the second player wear a blue robe instead of a red one. The other 4 screens are featured in the Exploding Fist Plus CPC game, and there's a couple of similar locations to the original Commodore 64 Fist. The level 1 screen, Tori, is pretty much as it was in the original, and level 4 Buddha is similar enough, if a bit rearranged. The big temple building is a completely new background, as is a rather out of place Egyptian background. After all, this is not international karate. Although the animations are pretty much spot on, it took a while for me to notice there's something odd about the CPC screens. The thing is, the lower half of the screen is always the same, with a section of a lighter shade yellow, which contains the two lion statues, and a section of a darker yellow, which contains the two fighters, and the fighters never collide with any of the more complex background graphics, unlike on the Commodore 64. As if that would have been impossible to pull off on the Amstrad. Then again, this clear separation must have made the modifications for new background graphics considerably easier, and the lack of collision with background graphics has made it possible to make the game slightly faster than the original. Still, too bad you can only load one background at a time. And on the Amstrad you get a similar set of sounds as on the Spectrum, but they're placed by the AY chip, so the brief level starting ditty has harmonics, which sort of makes it closer to the Commodore 64 original, but only barely. Unfortunately, the sample sound effects are of a low quality, and there are not nearly as many of them here, so I'm ranking the CPC version sounds below the Spectrum version. Okay, so we're going to look at both the Acorn BBC Micro and the Acorn Electron versions of the game now. Let's start by looking at the BBC Micro first though. So, the game was converted for the Acorn BBC Micro by Michael Simpson and published by Melbourne House in 1985. Now, I would say both Acorn versions have very similar graphics to each other, only there's a BBC Micro version which features one level more to the original Acorn releases. The first BBC Micro version featured only the Buddha screen, while the second BBC version also had the indoors screen. It's all a bit less colourful than the Spectrum version, and it's certainly blocker than any version up to this point. The animations are clearly jerkier than in the original Commodore 64, and the BBC Micro version also plays at a similar speed to the Spectrum version. And for the two Acorn machines, they did manage to fit in two different tunes, an abbreviated version of the original Dance of the Yo People segment, which plays during both the demonstration and while you're playing, and the Game Over jingle is where it's supposed to be. And also, the sound effects are pretty much similar to the Amstrad, but slightly better defined. The BBC Micro version has better sound capabilities, so the Yo People tune has two simultaneous melodies. And the sound effects sound more like samples, whereas the Electron version sounds like you were playing an 80s DOS game with traditional beeper sounds. So, the BBC Micro version gets seated above the Spectrum and the Amstrad versions when it comes to sound, while the Electron version goes below them. Anyway, let's have a look at the Acorn Electron version now. Again, like the BBC Micro, this version was done by Michael Simpson and published by Melbourne House in 1985 too. Now, the Electron version runs a bit slower and choppier compared to the BBC Micro version. And as I already mentioned, both Acorn versions have very similar graphics to each other, except the Electron version features only the Buddha screen. Anyway, let's have a look at the game. Okay, so we're going to have a look at another version, and that version was released in 1986 for the Commodore 16. You get 16 movements, of which 2 are for walking back and forth and 2 are for blocking high and low, which replace the 2 somersault moves from the original version. You also get no flying kick, so it doesn't matter whether you press the fire button when jumping or not, you just jump. Counting these out, you are left with 11 fight moves. And this version, well, it only features a single screen for background graphics, and that is the Buddha screen. And as you can see, the details are minimal. The fighters are monochrome and smaller than in any other version. This version just simply lacks the finesse in animations that we've seen in the previous versions. And with regards to the sounds, well, the C16's version sounds are almost directly on par with the Electron version, with the main title theme and Game Over jingle played as if coming from a single channel beeper, and the sound effects being nothing more than 2 or 3 slightly different smash noises. Okay, so that was the original games of The Way of the Fist, developed by Beam Software and released by Melbourne House. I have to say, the overall reception for these games were pretty good. The game topped the UK software charts for 2 months in September and October 1985, until it was replaced by Monty on the Run. And the game also became the best-selling computer game of 1985 in the UK. It sold 150,000 copies for the ZX Spectrum by 1987, and a total of 500,000 copies across all platforms in Europe. The Commodore 64 version particularly received positive reviews, and in Zap 64, the magazine, it called it a sizzler and praised the game's sound and graphics, scoring it 93% overall. Ahoy said that the Commodore 64 version was an excellent start for a new software label, with a good balance of action and strategy, and some of the best graphics of the year. The game was voted Game of the Year at the 3rd Golden Joystick Awards, with Melbourne House picking up the Best Software House. It also received the voted Best Game Award at the Saturday Superstore Viewer Awards. The ZX Spectrum version was placed at number 67 on your Sinclair official top 100 list in 1991. And then finally in 1996, GamesMaster ranked the game 76 on their top 100 games of all time list. See, I told you, all very positive for this game. Now, our journey doesn't end here. Actually, there were a number of unofficial homebrew versions released of The Way of the Exploding Fist, and not to mention that there were 3 sequels. So, why not? Let's have a look at those games, shall we? Our first unofficial game is the release of the Sharp MSZ800 port, which was written by Michael Creedle, and this was published in 1987. The Sharp MZ800 features 3 of the original's 4 screens, with the second one missing. The Sharp version makes up for the lack of colour with clarity, but having only 3 colours on the screen is a bit disheartening to look at. The MZ800 version is slightly slower than the original, but it's not annoyingly so. And the sounds are very similar to the Spectrum version as well. There was also an unofficial conversion for the Commodore Plus/4, written by Thomas Sazavari in 1993. And I suppose this game is rewritten using the original graphics. And I have to say, this version manages to beat its most immediate competitor, which is the C16 version. The first difference you will notice is both players wear the same colours, so I suppose it is hard to see at first which one you're controlling, because player 1 is actually the one who starts from the right side of the screen instead of his usual left. There aren't nearly as many fighting moves in the Plus version as in the other versions. I counted only 10 moves, plus the walking moves. The only important moves missing though are the somersaults, but some of the fighting moves are oddly placed in the joystick, such as the flying kick, which is backwards, up and diagonal. But on a more positive note, you can switch directions with the crouching punch as well as the roundhouse kick. Yet on another less positive note, the hit detection for all the fighting moves is not exactly perfect. Also worth noting is that a round doesn't end with 2 full yin-yangs, nor even 3. In fact, a round ends only when the time is out, and the winner is declared with the amount of hit points gathered. And it's also too bad that the AI is quite difficult to beat even in novice mode, mostly due to the hit detection problems. But at least the visuals are pretty close to the original, apart from there only being 3 locations and the obvious player colouring problem, but that's still 2 more than the C16, and the audio is a bit more acceptable than on the C16, featuring a unique in-game tune and an inventive use of the 2-channel TED chip to feature some harmonics. But for me, I would definitely rather play this version than say half of the official versions we just looked at, because it looks good and it plays fast enough. There was also an unofficial port of the C16 version, which was released for the Atari 400 and 800, and this was written by Fandel and Miker in 2017. And just like the C16 version, you get 16 movements. Though I would say the Atari version has a small advantage of speed over the original 16 version it was ported from, but they might as well share the same bottom of the barrel, not much difference. Now, the Atari version featured only a single screen for background graphics, and that is the Buddha screen. The details are minimal and the fighters are monochrome and smaller than any of the other versions. But at least it has more colour than that MZ800 version. And with regards to the sound, well, the Atari version is a clear upgrade from its C16 original, with a Yo People tune now rivaling the C64 edition and featuring two completely original jingles for winning a match and the inventable Game Over. The sound effects are also just about as varied and interesting as in the C64 and Spectrum versions, but completely differently programmed since they're not voice samples. It's a rather odd balance to the otherwise faithful port of a subpar version of the game. Let's have a look. Now, there was actually a NES version, which was originally developed by Beam Software, with the last prototype being from 1990. And this prototype was modified to be finishable, and the final release was made in 2019 by Pico Interactive. And the Pico version has also been released for the Evercade handheld console in 2021. The NES version is actually called Exploding Fist, with the way of the taken out of the title. Also gone is the traditional form of score counting, replaced with a style of bouting pretty much exactly like in International Karate by System 3. There's even a 3-player mode in the NES Exploding Fist, which suggests a consequence of IK Plus becoming the yardstick, and Melbourne House's own actual Exploding Fist Plus, but not the CPC Plus version game. Basically a carbon copy of IK Plus, being the last published game in the series. The single player mode is played against one computer opponent, and the 2-player mode is played by 2 human opponents against one computer opponent. Concerning the fighting moves, well, the NES version differs a bit from the original, with both action buttons of the NES pad being in use. Although there seems to be as many moves as in the original, they are located a bit illogically due to how unspecific the D-pad on a NES controller can be. There are also more background graphics in the NES Exploding Fist than even in the original version, and the 3rd player adds some more colour into the fighting too. The originally ever-present judge has also been taken away from the picture, though even if his speech bubbles remain. Musically, there's only a hint of Oriental left in the completely remade theme tune, which is a bit too energetic, certainly if we were playing the original Commodore 64 version, but this NES version also plays notably quicker, so the upbeat music fits here quite well. Sound-wise, the effects are okay also, for what they are, but there are no voice samples in this version of the game, which is a little bit disappointing. Although it's not precisely an attempt at recreating the way of the Exploding Fist on the NES, it's still a rather good game, and certainly miles better than the NES port of Karate Champ. But it is a different game, and you can't really compare it to the original version of the game. Okay, now this is an interesting version of the game. This is the 2023 ZX Spectrum NIX version, which was done in cooperation with Spec Next Limited and Wasp Studio. And this updated version, well, it maintains the essence of the original while incorporating modern enhancements. Players can engage in karate combat with configurable player colours and a rich 9-channel soundtrack by Richard Braithwaite, complemented by digital music from guitarist Konstantin Mihalis. Featuring 8 hand-painted screens, some animated, adapted from the unreleased Amiga version by Stephen Day, the game offers a nostalgic yet fresh visual experience. The enhanced opponent AI and online high score tables provide a competitive edge, allowing players to compare their skills globally. And the game is set in traditional dojo environments where players can choose between one player and two player modes. And similar to the original, the objective is to progress through Dan levels by defeating increasingly skilled opponents. The scoring system rewards precision and execution, emphasising strategy over brute force. Controls are initiative with options for keyboard or joystick input. And players can practice moves in the controls demo mode, ensuring they master the art of karate. This blend of retro charm and modern gameplay makes The Way of the Exploding Fist a timeless piece for both old fans and newcomers. Let's have a look at the game. Right, so now I want to talk about the sequels, and there were 3 sequels. Fist 2, The Legend Continues, which was released in 1986, and then there was Fist 2 The Tournament, which was released in 1987, and then finally Exploding Fist Plus. So, let's start by looking at those games, starting with Fist 2 The Legend Continues. And this game, well, it plays quite differently to its predecessor. It was, once again, developed by Beam Software, mostly by the same people who made the first one, and first published by Melbourne House in 1986. The game is more of a scrolling action game, with exploration and fighting game elements, rather than a straightforward one-on-one beat-em-up. You control a lone warrior who is on a quest to find 8 scrolls, also known as trigrams, in order to beat an evil warlock. You walk from location to location, climbing ladders, exploring caves and taking on various opponents sent by the warlock to take you down. Once you find a trigram, you must then take it to a corresponding shrine and meditate to absorb its powers. This will also give you an extra life, which is good because you only start with 1. During combat, your life energy and that of your opponent is represented as a horizontal strip at the bottom of the screen. If this reaches 0, then the game ends and you're unceremoniously dumped back to the start of the game again. There's no endgame screen and no title screen, which makes the game feel bare and a little bit unfinished. The fighting doesn't work half as well in The Way of the Exploding Fist, and the life bar often drops from full to nothing in just one hit. Opponents aren't particularly varied either. In fact, the first few opponents look identical to you, except they're wearing a green baseball cap, which just seems silly to me. Why choose to do that with the first opponents when you really need to be impressing the player at this stage of the game, not making them laugh at your laziness? The scrolling's a bit weird too. You often have to wait for the screen to catch up as you move, and there are bugs that make defeated enemies reappear and also make it difficult to get past certain areas. Fortunately, there are fan-fixed versions that negate these bugs, but Fist 2 is still a half-baked game that requires too much walking around doing nothing. Now, I've certainly seen people online saying that Fist 2 is brilliant, and that it has one of the best Commodore 64 soundtracks ever, and while these individuals are welcome to their opinions, they really are talking absolute shite. Because Fist 2 for me is a serious disappointment after the excellence of the first game. Even the music in this is short, repetitive and annoying, which is surprising as it was written by Neil Brennan, who did the music for the first game. But in saying that, that's just my opinion. And my recommendation is, if you are going to play this game, well, please find a version that's fixed. Otherwise, those bugs will just knock you out. Next up is Fist 2 The Tournament. A one-on-one tournament version of Fist 2 was given away for free on side 2 of the supplied cassette, and that too has serious problems. My guess is that it was the prototype for Fist 2 before the developers decided to make it a different game. And when they realised that the main game wasn't up to scratch, they decided to give it away for free as a sweetener. Which, in my opinion, didn't work. Both games leave a bitter taste in the mouth, to be completely honest with you. And finally, let's have a look at Exploding Fist Plus. Punch and kick your way through to 10th Dan. In this ultimate in street fighting experiences, they attempt to defend your title against tougher and more skillful opponents. Exploding Fist Plus contains 16 moves combining to make this the slickest fighting game yet. Fast and furious action from the word go as you punch and kick to defeat not one but two dazzling opponents on the rough, tough streets of downtown New York, the toughest neighbourhood around. I was okay with this game, I quite liked it. The animating backgrounds add an atmosphere to this great game too. Let's have a look at the game, shall we? So, there you go, that was my video covering the way of the Exploding Fist. Now sure, the colourful characters of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat were still several years away, and so, looking back on the Exploding Fist, it feels quite quaint now, simply because the fighters that the player selects don't have over-the-top personalities. However, for me, for the time, the mechanics of the game and the novelty of playing at home were just what made it stand out. Would fighting games have progressed without Way of the Fist? Certainly. This game was groundbreaking for all the reasons mentioned, but it is possible to imagine an alternative reality with a different game because the true breakout in terms of fighting games you could play at home. But for me, what's nice about the timeline we do live in is that Exploding Fist has a kind of quiet dignity to it. It might not particularly be bombastic or showy with its gameplay, but the moves of the fighters feel appropriately elegant for the type of martial arts game it's trying to be. It's not that the game holds up to modern standards, because it doesn't. But you can see why its fairly simple approach was so addictive back in the day. Because back when games like Karate Champ required you to put another coin in the arcade, the triumph of Exploding Fist was that you could keep fighting and keep getting better for as long as you wanted. So for that, I say spot on to a great game back in the day. So much nostalgia. So thank you for watching my video. It is very much appreciated. Thank you. Now, please leave a comment. Have you played any of these games? Did you think they were good? Do you agree with my video? Please let me know. I am very interested. And if you did like my video, then please press that like button. And it would be even better if you would subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. That would just be brilliant if you could do that. I like the subscribers. I like it when you press the subscribe button. It makes me very happy. So take care of yourself, and I'll see you all very soon again. Bye bye.